concept of an industrial hinterland or industrial zone outside the city is basically the idea that as rents increase near the center of the city, this varies with cities and with century, industrial firms tend to move out, not to the suburbs necessarily, but near the city or relatively outside where they can rent larger pieces of land or be in industrial parks. Industrial hinterlands contain a whole population of firms, and they are typically always animated, both financially as well as supplied with talent, by a nearby city. Today, for instance, we're going to compare Silicon Valley, which is of course animated by a city like San Francisco, and is connected to institutional organizations like Stanford University, supplying one of its inputs, the people that go on to become entrepreneurs, that go on to become part of joint stock corporations, and Route 128 in Boston, or outside of Boston, which is another industrial area, animated, of course, in this case by the city of Boston, getting one of its inputs, its supply of human talent from universities like MIT. We're also going to be talking about industrial hinterlands in Europe, the most famous of which, at least the most famous in the last 3 decades, is called Emilia-Romagna. I will write down the name in a second. And again, what we're trying to do, we're still talking about urban economics. We're talking about philosophy of history as applied to the economic aspect, the economic dynamics of urban centers, before we move on to an entirely different subject that we're going to start today at around, when we get back from lunch. We're going to be moving to cities as ecosystems. Therefore, we're going to be switching to biological aspects of cities. So this is basically the last thing we're going to be saying about economics. Remember also that we're talking about, this is a philosophy class. We're using history not as an excuse, but as a source of examples and ideas that then we can use to give more body to a philosophy, so that the philosophy doesn't become a priori, philosophy created by thought alone, but it's a philosophy based on evidence. For every claim that you make, you can supply a certain amount of evidence. So before I start, then I'm going to make a few philosophical points, sort of like what we've been doing throughout the semester, or throughout the class. Last class, I emphasized the fact that all the entities that we're dealing with here in class, persons, communities, organizations, social justice movements, social classes, federal governments, industrial networks, buildings, neighborhoods, cities, regions, provinces, nation states, each and every one of those entities is a historical individual. That is a unique, unreproducible, singular entity that has a date of birth and at least potentially a date of death. Philosophically, the best example that you can have in your mind to think about this new notion of what an individual is, because as I said last class, typically we associate the word individual with persons. In fact, we simply talk about the relationships between the individual and society, meaning the relationship between the very micro and the very macro aspects of a social system. And that is an okay usage, it's ordinary usage. I take the word individual used that way as a kind of shortening of the phrase individual person. But everybody can agree that it makes sense to speak of individual cities, unique historical entities that you can point to in a map. And it also makes perfect sense to talk about individual communities, individual organizations, this hospital, this university, that university. As I said, the best example of this new use of individual, which doesn't apply only to persons, is the concept of an individual species. And it's particularly important because the species have been treated since Aristotle Aristotle being our main realist philosopher for the last 2,500 years, and therefore the one that we have to compare ourselves with, since we are doing realist philosophy, materialist philosophy, but it falls under the category of realism. The world exists independently of our minds. Aristotle is the most famous realist philosopher ever. He was not necessarily a materialist, but he was a realist. He believed in the existence of essences, of transcendent entities he called essences. And therefore, he's not a materialist in our sense. Nevertheless, he was the most important realist philosopher, and therefore we always can use him as a point of reference. His notion of what a species was, something over and above individual organisms, something transcendent, something capturing an essence of those individual organisms, predominated until, of course, Darwin came along, and until the followers of Darwin, for the first time, were able to prove that reproductive isolation of a community is what produces the event of speciation, which, as I said last class, is the exact equivalent of birth in the case of organisms. The moment of speciation, and it's not, of course, a moment, it might be something that takes 1,000 years to occur, but once a species cannot blend its genetic materials with another, then that species has become a unique historical individual. And it can die through extinction. And once a species becomes extinct, it doesn't even matter, for instance, when zebras become extinct, it doesn't matter if later on other horse-like creatures with black and white camouflage appear in this planet. Those new creatures will not be zebras in the strict sense of the word. Unless they are genealogically connected to the zebras that we call zebras today. There will be another species which happens to look very much like zebras. So, species are unique, singular, unreproducible entities, which means that when we send them to extinction, that's it for that species. If we cause their death, there is no way we can bring them back. Now that is an example I want you to keep in mind when I use the word individual. Individual species, because it contrasts sharply with Aristotle. And since Aristotle has been the dominant view for 2,500 years, that is the one that we have to contrast ourselves with. And we're using the word individual for all the entities that we talked about here. Individual nation states, individual cities, individual neighborhoods, individual buildings, individual communities, and so on. That I had already said, so I'm basically just summarizing it. The new point I want to make right now is that every individual entity that we're going to be talking about today, we should always think of it in terms of populations of these individuals. Not a single individual person, but always a multiplicity of persons, a plurality of communities, a large population of different organizations, large numbers of cities, relatively large numbers of nation states. So it might seem paradoxical that we're placing the emphasis on individuals and at the same time on populations, but there is no paradox here. Individual means unique, but it doesn't mean singular. Okay, let me just explain that. The word singular has two meanings. One, singular as opposed to plural. One versus many, and that's not the sense in which I'm using the word here. I'm using it singular as opposed to ordinary. Singular in the sense of unique as a historical entity, but not necessarily a one, consisting of one member. On the contrary, individuals, in the ontological sense that I'm talking about here, always come in bunches, always come in populations, in collectivities, in pluralities. And philosophically, that means that we always have to think about it probabilistically. Because we always have to think about the population and then think about how is variation distributed in that population. thinking probabilistically. This goes directly against essentialism, which was one of the rules that we set out. The basic of thinking probabilistically is to ask the question always, how is variation distributed in a population of individual entities? In other words, the emphasis is always in variation. We're not asking what is the one thing, what is the core set of properties that every member of that population has in common, because that core set of properties will of course be an essence. You know, there might be overlaps, for instance, between the DNA of this one zebra and the DNA of this other zebra and the DNA of this other zebra, but we are much less interested in those overlaps than in how are the mutations and sexual recombination variations distributed in that in that gene pool. Because we will see in a future class on Monday, without variation, there is no evolution. Evolution needs variation as its fuel. And that is precisely why Darwin broke with Aristotle so clearly. Because for Aristotle, variation was a nuisance. It is what hides the true essence of what makes zebras zebras. All the variation in the camouflage, variation in the height of zebras, variation in the speed at which they run, would hide what is common to all of them. And so for Aristotle, variation was a nuisance. For us, variation is the key. Because variation is what fuels evolution, and variation is something that actually exists out there in a population. So whether we're talking about a population of industrial firms, as we're going to be talking about today, or we talk about a population of cities, or a population of countries, what we always want to know is for a particular property of cities, say their density or their size, or a particular property of organizations, say the degree of centralization, or any one of these 6 variables, what we want to know is how is that variation distributed in a population. We want to know whether the variation or the distribution of variation has a shape. For instance, we've been talking about how an economic region becomes coherent when prices begin to go up and down at the same time, and that when demand and supply begin to affect the entire region simultaneously. But I said that applies not to spot prices, the price in this little store, the price in that little store, but to average prices. And to talk about average prices, to say in the population of prices, there's going to be a distribution that has a certain form, in which this is the population, and the majority of the population is close to the average. And there are, yes, a few outliers here on the tails of the distribution. Each one of those points is one member of the population, and we always want to know what is the overall shape of the distribution of variation in that population. Sometimes that is the shape. This is called a normal distribution. It's a very famous one because you can find it in many different, for instance, the distribution of heights in human beings. There will be an average height in a particular population, and there will be very short people, a few short people, a few tall people. Not all distributions are like that. Not all distributions have averages. For instance, distribution of sizes for cities is more like that. This is called, let's put a set of axes so we can have some kind of reference. This is called a long tail distribution, which is a normal distribution. And particular case, the smaller the cities, the more cities are with that size. There's only one city typically in a particular population with the largest size. There's two, perhaps three of the next size, and the sizes are arranged in a hierarchy with a long tail for the very, very small cities. This long tail distribution is also useful for many other things, many other populations. For instance, think of the population, which is an almost extinct population, the population of books and records in bookstores and record stores, as opposed to online. In bookstores, they have a few big hits, you know, the best sellers, and they have many of those best sellers. And then depending on the amount of sales, they will have less and less, and then there will be a very long amount of books that they don't carry because they sell 1, 2, or 3 copies. Those books make up all those obscure books or obscure records that are almost never carried by a bookstore, are distributed in the long tail. Today, of course, with the availability of online shopping and the decreasing reliance on actual warehousing, that is in which Amazon needs to warehouse books, but iTunes, for instance, doesn't really need to warehouse CDs, and therefore all they need to do is have a link or have a file with that particular obscure song. So all of a sudden, the long tail part of the distribution of records and books has become something profitable. And what all you need now is means to explore the long tail. And that is what people who bought this also bought that type of ideas is supposed to be there for, to help you explore the long tail. Since the long tail is going to contain a lot of obscure artists, but maybe if someone who bought a record that you also bought might know the name of one of those obscure artists and allows you to begin exploring the long tail. Once you get back to that record, there might be, people who bought this but also that, and other devices more sophisticated than that are there to allow you to explore the long tail. Now that's a separate subject. This long tail distribution also applies to the distribution of sizes of seeds, which is why I'm putting it here. It doesn't really have an average. It's a different type of distribution. There's several probabilistic distributions. And the important thing is that they allow us to think about populations, and they allow us to always think of the variation of a population. How is it distributed? That way, it prevents us from thinking, or at least it's a good safeguard against essentialism, a good safeguard against concentrating, like Aristotle did, on what doesn't vary, what stays the same, the essence, as opposed to concentrating on what varies. That is the modern way of thinking about this thing. Populations are typically studied always by sampling them. You sample, that's what they do when they conduct polls, for instance, about political opinion and so on. They don't really make a census of the entire population. What they do is to try to get a representative sample, something that is large enough, but that contains within it the same distribution of variation that scales up nicely. And then we extrapolate from that sample. Now, most of the evidence for most of the historical ideas that we've been talking about in this class, and that I will be introducing later on in class, come from, of course, statistics. Come from statistics that have been gathered by governments, or statistics that can be statistical series that can be reconstructed from the books of firms, going all the way back to the 14th century when firms were already keeping relatively good records. They have, those records are there for historians to study, and by using them, you can reconstruct certain time series which show you either distributions or variation in space or trends in time. Which basically means we're never thinking deterministically. We're always saying the odds are that this trend will continue, or the average this property varies on average this or that way. Where now we're going to need to apply this to the ideas that we were discussing here. Going back then to industrial hinterlands. An industrial hinterland like Silicon Valley, Route 128, or Emilia Romagna always contains a population numbering in the thousands of firms. So clearly what we want to know is how are these variables distributed in the population? We will rarely find a case in which every member of the population engages in economies of agglomeration. That is, in which every single firm is staffed by skilled people. We're going to find combinations, mixtures. And what we're interested in is averages, or to put it another way, we're interested in proportions. What is the proportion of the population that engages in economies of agglomeration? What is the proportion that clearly engages in economies of scale? And what proportion is a mixture of the two? And then we can then plot, just like I just did, with points representing each individual firm, how they cluster. Do they tend, in a particular industrial hinterland, they tend to cluster around these values with skilled people, run by entrepreneurs, being mostly price takers, engaging in anonymous competition and so on? Or do they tend to cluster along the variables in the upper part of the board? And of course, we also need to consider all the mixtures in between. If the cluster is somewhere in between, then we're going to have a very, with the majority of firms practicing a little bit of economies of scale, but also valuing skilled labor and entrepreneurial vision. And we're going to find a distribution somewhere in the middle of this, and that will be part of the evidence that we have that industrial region has a certain structure, that its population of firms has a certain composition. So let's begin then by contrasting two very well-known industrial hinterlands, Silicon Valley and Route 128. As I said at the beginning of the class, all industrial hinterlands are typically animated from slightly far away by a city or group of cities. I'm going to only write one name here. San Francisco and Boston. Each one of those two regions will contain a population of industrial organizations with different compositions of these variables. And in addition, will contain organizations, some of which are government organizations, some of which are worker organizations like unions, some of which are owner organizations like trade associations, some of which are organizations that provide inputs to the industrial firms, like I said, universities, Stanford, MIT. Now, I'm going to use here the data from a researcher called Annalie Saxenian. I don't believe I put this book in your syllabus. It's a beautiful book called Regional Advantage. It's, of course, dealing with industrial regions or industrial hinterlands. And unlike many books which simply make a comparison of the statistics of one area with the statistics of another, this actually follows the statistical distribution over time. That's, for our purposes, that's always better. Not just a snapshot of the distribution of variation at a particular time, but how that variation changes over time. In this particular case, it would be nice to have, and this is what Annalie Saxenian does, to make a study of these populations for, say, 3 or 4 decades. Why? Because there is this, because economic life tends to be cyclical or cyclical. There's always upswings in the business cycle, downswings in the business cycle. Business cycles come in different lengths. Different economists believe in different types of cycles. Just about every economist believes in short-term cycles. 3-year upswings, 3-year downswings. But there are others, including the historian that we have been talking about most, Fernand Rodel, who believes in a cycle called the Kondratiev cycle. Kondratiev cycle was discovered looking at the statistics of the history of prices by a Russian named Kondratiev early in the 20th century. And that is a cycle that's 20 years up, 10 years plateau, 20 years down. So it's a 50-year long cycle. Because it's 50 years, it fits beautifully in a century, 2 Kondratiev per century, and therefore 2 upswings and 2 downswings. I happen to believe in the Kondratiev. I happen to believe that there is historical evidence, statistical evidence for it, but many economists don't believe in the Kondratiev, mostly because we don't have an explanation for it. We don't have a mechanism that shows how exactly a 50-year up and down cycle can last for 4 or 5 centuries, which is where we can see it. We can see it in the time series or the statistics for the history of the wholesale prices for certain commodities like iron, corn. You can clearly see that the prices go up, then they plateau, and they come down. They go up, they plateau, they come down. But because we don't have yet a mechanism to explain it, very few economists believe in the Kondratiev. Nevertheless, there are books entirely dedicated to the Kondratiev wave, and today it is very significant or very important because we're supposed to be right now on the upswing of the Kondratiev, if the Kondratiev theory is true, which means that if the Kondratiev theory is true, the current recession that was caused, as I explained the other day, by collateralized debt obligations coupled to credit default swaps, in addition to a housing bubble that burst, it means that this recession will be very shallow. If we were in the downswing of the Kondratiev, as we were in the 80s and 90s, remember the 80s, Reagan had a recession, Bush father lost the election because of the economy. That's when the phrase, "it's the economy stupid," was coined for the first time. And he had won the war in Iraq, or he got, recovered Kuwait, so he was like a war hero, and yet he lost against Clinton, who already had several scandals dragging along with him, because it's the economy stupid. Clinton's years were also part of the downturn, except that the Kondratiev, you can add exogenous shocks. In this particular case, the internet boom, the dot-com bubble, which was an external, technologically produced shock that injected energy into economic life and then made the 1990s less of a drag. At any rate, I'm hoping that the Kondratiev theory is true, because that means that our current recession will be shallow. We'll come out of it relatively fast and keep going up the upswing until the 20s, the 2020s. At any rate, that was a side comment. Annalisa Tsinian is conscious that, or aware that there are shorter economic cycles, and that therefore when you compare 2 industrial regions for performance, you have to do it at least including 1 or 2 upswings and downswings of the cycle. Why? Because during an upswing, everybody does well. It doesn't really matter whether you're operating on economies of scale or you're operating on economies of agglomeration. Both have their own types of efficiencies. Both produce wealth. The question when we compare them is therefore the hidden costs. And we also want to know how robust or resilient they are relative to downswings in the economic cycle. So Annalisa Tsinian compares these 2 regions for 3 decades, capturing at least 1 downswing of the economic cycle, and shows very clearly that a region dominated by economies of agglomeration, such as Silicon Valley, is more robust, more resilient, less brittle, less fragile against economic downturns than Route 128, which at the time, we're talking about the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was dominated by large firms. Now the comparison in this case is possible to be made because in both cases they manufacture computing equipment, mostly. Silicon Valley, of course, has large corporations. Intel, for instance, is huge. Xerox is huge. But was seeded by companies that are today incredibly large. Apple, the company that we already mentioned, is today the second largest, at least for the market valuation, the second largest company in the United States, just second only to Exxon. It already passed Microsoft. So it's hardly an example of a small firm, and yet it started as a small firm, $1,300 in a garage. Now, Apple invented what is called, and I already mentioned this, an open architecture. The back side of the Apple II could be opened, and you could plug in boards that were specialty boards. If you were a video maker, you could plug in a video grabber board. If you were a number cruncher, some kind of mathematician, you could plug in a number crunching board. If you were a musician, you could plug in a sound synthesizer board. But in order to do that, Apple had to give away or make public all the specifications of the bus, the part where the boards plug in and through which they communicate with the rest of the computer. The bus, that's what it's called, is normally not public information. Normally, the specifications for a bus are not normally made public by most companies. Apple did make it public because it knew that by doing that it would create a cottage industry of small firms creating boards for the Apple II. It also made public its specifications for operating system. It later on it closed them down with a Macintosh, totally mistakenly, which meant that a lot of people could write games for the Apple II, they could write word processors for the Apple II, they could write a whole variety of applications for the Apple II, which meant that an entire ecosystem of small firms grew around the original Apple company and was part of what seeded Silicon Valley. Hewlett-Packard, which today is of course a gigantic firm that hardly can be said to be operating on economies of agglomeration, began its life also operating in terms of economies of agglomeration. Also open, also small, also in connection with many other small firms. Nevertheless, firms start small and they grow big, and so what we have to be taking into account here is a change in composition of sizes in a population of organizations. And at all point, what we have to keep in mind is averages or other statistical distributions of variation, and say what proportion of the population is engaging in something that looks like economies of agglomeration, like those 6 variables, what proportion is not. Overall, when you compare these two industrial hinterlands, Route 128 was dominated at the time that we're talking about, this is the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s, by huge firms, most of which don't exist anymore. You probably don't even remember them. You're too young to remember mini computers. The only mini computer you could have possibly have seen is a Silicon Graphics workstation, if at all. But you don't remember the mini computers made by DEC, or the mini computers made by One, or the mini computers made by Digital. Those were huge firms with incredible amounts of profits back in the 70s. They were the main competitors of IBM. IBM created mainframes. These companies created mini computers, which were not personal computers, were 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 type of machines, although they were kind of desktop already. And they were typically self-reliant. In other words, if they needed anyone to write software for them, instead of farming out that software to a bunch of little companies that are part of their ecosystem, they would simply buy that little company and integrate it. Remember what the name of that process is. If you're a large corporation who buys a small company in the same if you buy one of your suppliers, that is called a vertical integration. Same thing if you buy one of your distributors. It's downstream and upstream vertical integration. You simply buy them and you convert them into a division of your own large company. If you buy companies that are in other areas in order to obtain what is called economies of scope, which I'm not even putting here, but it's another type of efficiencies, when you have a bunch of different products whose consumption stimulates one another, then that is called horizontal integration. Either way, many large companies grow that way. They don't grow organically. They grow by acquisitions. And that is the way DEC, One, Digital, and a bunch of other companies in Route 128 have grown. Another difference between Route 128 and Silicon Valley is the role and the structure of the role of talented people and creative people. In Route 128, you typically confine people into what is called a research and development laboratory. It's an important place. There's a lot of talented people agglomerated, so to speak. But they are confined to that R&D laboratory, and their decisions are not final. They invent things, but then a manager can come and say, hey, you know, that's a great product, but it will cannibalize our current product line, so we're going to have to put it on hold. That apparently is what happened to the cell phone and AT&T, which could have been the very first AT&T, by the way, before it was broken up, when it was Mabel. They had the cell phone, and they had something, or at least something similar, and the manager decided that that was going to cannibalize their current product line, so let's just wait it and put it on hold. If you are a person working in one of the small companies in Silicon Valley, you don't have that problem. You come up with your first MP3 player and you put it out as fast as possible. So talent, which exists in both areas, its power is circumscribed by the role they play in a research and development laboratory and by the place that research and development laboratory has in the authority structure of the firm. So you don't have final decision-making power, you are the creatives, you're supposed to be producing new products, but you don't necessarily have any say as to the marketing or even the strategy for launching such a product. With small firms, you don't have all those layers of a hierarchy, you know, between you and the launching of your product. You are typically a startup that has a single product, you launch it right away, whether it's a software product like Facebook or Twitter, or whether it is a hardware product. So, another difference between the two, in addition to the fact that the proportion of small firms to large firms in Silicon Valley was much greater than in Route 128. It was dominated by a few large firms. It's what is called the turnover rate. The turnover rate is the average time that a talented person would spend in a particular firm. In Route 128, talented engineers, talented software designers tended to spend most of their lives in a company. This is particularly true for companies like IBM. That is not part of Route 128, of course, but you know, once you become part of IBM, you become part of IBM's culture. Seniority counts. The longer you have been in your job, your salary can depend on your seniority, on how long you've been around. And so it pays to stay with the same company. The turnover rate for Route 128 was very low. People would spend most of their careers in a firm. The turnover rate in Silicon Valley, according to Saxenian, was about 3 years. In other words, you're a software engineer, you join a new firm, you're a new startup, you're very excited by the new ideas that are going on there. Part of what your job is to be excited. And so you pursue it. 3 years later, most of the problems have been solved, things have become routine. Now it's just a matter of squeezing a few more drops of efficiency out of a particular product. The design cycle has gone to its boring part, you leave the firm and move to another. Now that is made possible, of course, by economies of agglomeration, because economies of agglomeration are based on the gathering together of lots of talented people and lots of little firms in one and the same region, which which means that there is always employment possibilities. If you're a talented software engineer and you've just spent 3 years working for a firm and now that your job has become boring, it's very easy to just walk across the street, literally, and get another job. That will be exciting. Join a new startup. So this is something that can be measured, again, as an average in the population. The turnover rate measured for Silicon Valley over those 2 decades was 3 years, which is incredibly fast. It means that there is a constant migration of talent through the region. And that talent brings with them their know-how. Remember the distinction we made between know-how and know-that. Know-that is linguistic-based knowledge. It's knowledge of true sentences. Those true sentences can be in books. Once something has become know-that, you don't need the person to travel around with that knowledge. You can just get a book, or you can just look it up in Wikipedia. We look it up in the internet. But if it's know-how, particularly know-how about cutting-edge technologies, you need the person whose skills those are. And so by moving around all those engineers around Silicon Valley, they nurture the region with knowledge. They cross-pollinate all those different firms with each other. They bring know-how that was useful for one firm, they combine it with the know-how of a new firm. And that constant motion means that the entire region is like one big company in a way, if you want to put it that way, one big R&D laboratory, an open one. Not so Route 128. They are, in this particular case, you want, if you're a large corporation, to internalize as many services and as many functions as you can, whether by buying smaller companies or by hiring talent and putting it in your R&D laboratory. That means that a large company can move anywhere it wants to because it's self-contained. It contains everything it needs. Unlike the smaller companies in Silicon Valley that depend on the ecosystem of other smaller companies and therefore cannot move anywhere else. Companies that are large, like the ones that inhabit the Route 128, can move anywhere else the moment government changes their tax structure. The moment they, if another government from another state offers them a very cheap land deal where they can build a new factory or build new headquarters and much cheaper than what they used to have, at more lower taxes, they simply move from one state to another and move with all their self-contained personnel and staff to the other place. In many cases, killing a small town, killing a region. Because particularly if they are large, and they have 100,000 employees, all of a sudden you have 100,000 unemployed people. At least if they could not move with the company. So, unlike Silicon Valley, in which the constant migration of engineers and the fact that it is in that region that you can find all the talent, like those firms that nurture the region, Route 128 type firms can actually poison a region, or at least they can threaten that region by withdrawing from it. Besides those differences, there is the one that I mentioned at the beginning, how robust or how tough they are against recessions, against downswings of the economic cycle. What Annalise Saxenian finds is that Silicon Valley was able to ride those downswings better. A few small firms go out of business, but the rest kind of support one another. Whereas Route 128 was very brittle. They all did well during an upswing, but the moment the downswing came, they started going out of business. In fact, Digital, DEC, One, all tried to come up with personal computers. Again, you probably don't remember this. This is the 1980s. To compete against the IBM per PC and the Mac, and they all failed because they tried to develop everything in-house as opposed to allowing 100, 1,000 firms to collaborate in building the product, to collaborate in building the value of the brand. Let me move on to another area where I have a little more data, and it's something that has been studied in more detail. It's an area, a region in Italy called Emilia-Romagna. This is unlike the ones that we just saw, this is an old region. If you look at maps of the 3rd century, right after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, there is already Emilia and there is already Romagna. So we're talking about extremely old regions and with a very long craft tradition. So in this particular case, the building of the skills, the pool of skills that makes our agglomeration economies had centuries to be created. Of course, we're talking today about the contemporary case of Emilia-Romagna. In the it is animated by cities, just like any other industrial hinterland. The cities here are Bologna. Bologna already had a university by the 11th century. It's an old city where knowledge has been valued for the longest time. Modena, which you might not have heard of, but you should have. That's where Maseratis are designed. It's a region that contains designers. That's the most important thing. It has contained designers and creative people for centuries. In the 1980s, this is where my data comes from, 80s and the 90s, Emilia-Romagna had 20,000 firms producing mostly ceramics and textiles, but also, so that's basically graphic design, but also industrial design. They also design machines for the creation or for the production of complex textiles, complex ceramics, which can be kind of one input to architects, or at least to interior decorators. Of those 20,000 firms, 90% in the 80s had less than 100 employees. So 90% of 20,000, that is something like 18,000 firms. We're talking about a large population, and we are talking about a population in which the average is sort of like this, right? With, or rather, the other way around. Very small tails and very fat middle, with most of them being small, dominated by small firms. Of those 90%, 50% was design independent. In other words, they performed their own design. They did not depend on external firms. Because of course you can be an area with 20,000 small firms, but if large companies like Benetton, say, do all the design somewhere else and they just hire you to actually produce this stuff, well, then you are the routine end of a dispersed economies of scale kind of thing. You need to do your own design in order to be able to count as economies of agglomeration. So 50% of the 20,000 firms, small with less than 100 employees and performing their own design. This is what made this region take off like crazy in the 1980s. It became the fastest growing region in Italy. It was such a miracle of productivity that MIT economists, their names are Sable and Fiori, wrote a book about it called The New Industrial Divide. Charles Sable, and I can't remember the name of Fiori, an Italian name. But it's a very famous book. Both are MIT economists. They went and spent time in Emilia-Romagna to study all the different, to gather the statistics, to gather the data, and to study the dynamics. Another book that you might be interested in on the same subject is Michael Best, The New Competition. Michael Best's book is interesting because it has a chapter on Emilia-Romagna, but it also has chapters on Japan, has chapters on different industrial clusters around the world in which conditions are different. For instance, in Japan, the large firms like Sony and Mitsubishi allow the small firms to stay alive because they use them as a source of innovation, as a source of ideas, but they keep them under control. In Emilia-Romagna, the small firms are the ones that are dominant. Now, I already said many things about what happens when you have 100 employees. For one thing, they are no barriers to entry, meaning you can start your own firm relatively easily. If all your competitors have 100 employees and you're a talented worker, like a worker that could be a designer, and you can, you are a worker because you were born, in a working class family, but you happen to be a designer. You walk out of that firm with 10 or 12 of your buddies, and you start your own firm with 20 people at first until you grow until you're 100. That means that Emilia-Romagna grows not so much by firms getting larger, but by the firms micro-specializing on smaller and smaller niches of design for ceramics and textiles. So the region continues to grow, the number of firms continues to grow, but they all stay small. They were perfectly aware that there is a limit of size beyond which managers and accountants become more important than designers. The amount of cash flow through your firm, the kinds of orders that you're getting, the scale of production, all means that logistics starts becoming more important than design. And therefore, it pays for them to stay small. And they are perfectly aware of that. However, in the 1990s, they began to face new challenges. For one thing, the European common market was beginning to mature. The euro, of course, did not exist yet, so there was not a single currency until 10 years later. But nevertheless, there was now mobility from and competition from other firms around Europe. There was also the beginning of competition from China, India, and other places with cheaper labor. So then the firms, which were always linked together via organizations like trade associations and unions, collectively decided to create some way of taking advantage of economies of scale. One thing, they created committees where they explored the problem, and they realized that there were at least 3 areas where they could profit from economies of scale without giving up their design independence. One of them was logistics, as I just said. Everything having to do with transportation, warehousing, accounting. You can profit from economies of scale. You're not using any of your talented people there. I mean, some accountants are very creative. Think of accountants behind a firm called Enron, which one of the, it kind of collapsed earlier on in the decade. Those accountants were very creative. When you see how many ghost companies they created to hide the profits and to hide the losses of the firm, that was all done by very artistic accountants. But normally, accounting doesn't really demand that much talent. Neither does warehousing, nor does driving things around and transporting them. Finance is another area because banks tend to be suspicious of lending to small businesses. And if they do, they lend you in terms that are not necessarily the best, with interest rates that may not necessarily be the best. Or if you have a pool of small firms, sort of like what Obama tried to do with insurance, try to get a pool of people, try to buy insurance in large quantities so as to reduce the price, then you can get better deals financing. And finally, marketing. Prior to the 90s, every one of the little firms sold their stuff, their ceramics, their textiles, their machines, under their own brand. So that means that there were 10,000 different brands. That was inefficient. By joining together to do marketing together, now they could sell under a few brands. So they lost their power to brand, but that doesn't matter. Because branding, the creative aspects of branding normally are performed by someone else. A graphic designer does the logo for the brand. An advertising agency does the commercials and so on. Marketing, of course, also involves the gathering of fashion information. Both ceramics and textiles are very much fashion-driven, so you need to go to fairs and detect fashion trends and so on. So, having located the three areas where they needed economies of scale, they decided to create three consortia, as they call them. Large companies with very deep hierarchies, a consortium for logistics, a consortium for finance, a consortium for marketing, with the exception that the three consortia were owned by the little guys. So they were not in competition with them, and they were not the kind of firms that could start buying little guys and incorporating them through vertical or horizontal integration. They were owned by the little guys. So what I like about this maneuver is that they did not stick to their original rhizomatic or networky state. They realized that competition from other countries was getting tough, that they needed a kind of defensive belt to protect them against this competition, and they decided to get their hands a little dirty, to add a little bit of economies of scale to their mostly economies of agglomeration type of system. And they did it. Three consortia operating on economies of scale, but giving all those efficiencies to the little guys. So what they produced was a very interesting hybrid. Emilia-Romagna still exists today. It's still going. I'm not touting it as utopia or as, the kind of the type of form that will save us all. For one thing, it is hard to create economies of agglomeration. You cannot command the economies of agglomeration to exist. People have tried to do it in Europe and elsewhere, and it doesn't work that way. Economies of agglomeration grow organically. What you can do as part of a government organization is facilitate this organic growth. For instance, you can invest money on industrial parks and then manipulate the rents in those industrial parks to make them lower to attract businesses, but in such a way that you put complementary businesses next to each other. So you would put a furniture designer in one part of the park next to a carpentry or a joinery place that specializes in certain aspects of furniture production, right next to a firm that can use sawdust as its input, perhaps to combine it with resins to create, not fiberglass, but other types of composites. Governments can do that. They can manipulate rents to do that. They can provide incentives for people to move in with complementary functions and begin to try to create the beginnings of such a complex economies of agglomeration ecosystem. But they cannot command it to exist, and they certainly cannot command it to exist in a certain amount of years. It needs to be nurtured, but it cannot be ordered to exist. It needs to grow organically. And of course, it grows through a certain kind of positive feedback or self-reinforcement dynamics. The more talented people move to the region, the more other talented people will want to move to the region. Because one of the attractions of a region performing using economies of agglomeration is the existence of other talented people with whom you can talk shop at the end of the day. They are less secretive than people that work in a research and development laboratory, many of whom may have signed non-disclosure agreements of different types, and therefore are much more tight-lipped when it comes to going to the bar or when it comes to hanging out and be talking about the latest software project that they did. People working for small firms tend to cross-pollinize one another. They are less secretive. They learn collectively. The entire region learns in a way as a whole, almost like an anthill effect. So, those are a couple of examples of today's combinations of these factors. Let me move now on to history. Because we may agree that as far as contemporary cases, this distinction makes sense, and yet disagree as to exactly when or how they came about. Marxists, for instance, I've had an opportunity to already say that I completely disagree with Marx's political economy. I consider myself a leftist. But the left has been dominated, at least as far as economic thinking goes, or people on the left have been dominated for 120 years by the theories of Karl Marx, and the theories of Karl Marx happen to be wrong. I already gave you an example last class, this theory of value. Only the raw muscular energy of proletarian labor produces value. Machines don't produce value. Capital doesn't, your savings and investment doesn't produce value. Design, whether architectural design or industrial design or graphic design or software design, doesn't produce value. Which had a consequence, as I already mentioned, that as you replace workers with machines, the rate of profit goes down, necessarily, because you're producing less value. You're adding machines that don't produce any value, getting rid of humans that do produce value. And that was supposed to be the internal contradiction of capitalism, but was going to destroy capitalism from within. The fact that inevitably, as a necessary outcome, the rate of profit was going to go down until it hit zero for a roboticized or a factory run by robots. Of course, everybody knows that factories run by robots produce value. In fact, they produce large amounts of profits. So that prediction was entirely wrong. It was his theory of value, or the labor theory of value, that led him into that direction, but also the fact that he broke the very first rule that we said we were not going to do here. He included teleology, or goal-directedness for history. History is directed towards communism because every mode of production has an internal contradiction, or several internal contradictions, and out of those contradictions, it comes its own demise, which is inevitable and necessary. So given this necessary logic of history, this deterministic sequence of modes of production, then he could predict exactly what was going to happen at the end, but having said that, he needed to locate some inevitable contradiction in capitalism, which is what made him subscribe to his labor theory of value, which, as we know, is entirely wrong. So we need to break with Marx. We also, of course, need to break with right-wing economics, which are reductionist. We need to use probabilistic thinking to get rid of that determinism. And we need to think in terms of not only persons making rational decisions to buy or to sell, but also what happens economically to communities, what happens to organizations, what happens to cities. We cannot just have rational decision makers running around. Now, as I already said, we have many other economists that we can use. John Kenneth Galbraith, who wrote in the 50s and 60s, he's a very famous person, an ambassador to India and so on, but he was also an economic thinker that was never given his right place in history because his theories were not easy to mathematize. You could not really create formal models out of them. Today with computer simulations, and unfortunately I cannot get into that very much, although my public lecture on Wednesday will be about that, we can instantiate Galbraith's ideas and test them formally in the computer without necessarily creating mathematical models. A more recent batch of thinkers, Douglas North, it's called this is the old institutionalist school of economics. This is the neo-institutionalist school of economics, Oliver, Williamson, and many others, can serve as a starting point for us to begin to think about a new political economy, a leftist political economy that's both materialist, but that does not owe anything, to dogmas from the past. You can do that. However, we're still going to need to contend with the large populations of intellectuals out there who are still either Marxists or simple-minded microeconomists who are going to oppose what we do. So let's speak of Marxists right now, because those are the ones that are going to be my target right now. Marxists have, as of late, acknowledged this difference. A little too late, 120 years too late. But they have given them labels that are entirely false historically. Your typical Marxist theoretician will call this Fordism, and they will call this post-Fordism. What else, right? The word post has to be the most useless prefix ever. Postmodernism, post-feminism, post-structuralism. What the hell does that even mean? You know, it's like, I was there and I know the one came after the other. That's all we know. We don't really know what it is, but we sure as hell know that it did not come after. I mean, it did not come before. It came afterwards. Well, thank you for the insight. Post-Fordism, is that true? Well, let's begin with Fordism. Is it true that Henry Ford invented economies of scale? Well, we all know that his factories to create those first cars, the T-model cars, were the paradigm of mass production. They came in they were all identical, and they came in a single color, black. Henry Ford used to say, they can get cars in any color they want to, as long as it's black. So he didn't really give a damn about fashion and so on. That's something that General Motors invented later on, as it did the idea of changing models relatively, with the seasons, for 3 years or 4 years, so as to create an incentive to buy and a certain kind of built-in obsolescence. Henry Ford was, somebody dedicated to economies of scale. And he did combine for the first time routinized labor, semi-skilled labor, with the assembly line as we know it, with large scale to produce identical copies. And as I said, the larger the number of identical copies you produce, the less the costs per unit. And in economies of scale, you compete in terms of costs. The small firms in Emilia-Romagna compete in terms of design. They, of course, also need to keep costs in mind. You cannot just begin splurging, spending your money in a crazy way. You need to keep your costs under control. But they don't compete to see whose costs are lower. Because if they did that, it would pay for them to become big. If you're going to compete in terms of cost, it pays to get large. If you're going to compete in terms of design, then that's a different story altogether. So, the question is, did Henry Ford invent economies of scale? Was the bourgeoisie, or was a bourgeois pig, the origin of this form of capitalism? Well, no. As I already mentioned last class, most of the components of economies of scale came from military arsenals and armories. And for a very good reason. It is in the battlefield that identical weapons matter more than in any other area of reality. The reason why is the very concept of a spare part. If you cannot supply, if every weapon is created by hand by a different skillful artisan, that weapon is going to be very valuable. It's a handmade weapon, and one day will probably be worth thousands of dollars to a collector. But as far as the military is concerned, if you take apart a handmade weapon into its pieces, say a musket or a rifle, and you take apart another musket or rifle made by a different artisan, and then you shuffle the pieces around and then try to put them back together, they will never ever fit. Which means that if a different artisan creates different weapons, you cannot supply a battlefield with spare parts. You need to supply them with fresh, entire weapons. And that is incredibly inefficient, and it can in fact lead you to lose a war. So it was in the military, beginning with the concept of a caliber. The caliber, or the size of the little spherical bullets that they used to use for muskets. Well, they came in different calibers. They used to use for larger pieces of artillery. The bore of the muzzle had to be of a certain dimensions, and those dimensions needed to fit the dimensions of the ammunition. And beginning with that, the idea of standardizing production began to take shape. The implementation of the idea, not the idea itself, its first implementation on a large scale is credited to a French armorer in the mid-18th century. His name is Honore Blanc. That's my first and my best attempt at pronouncing that French last name. Honore Blanc. He was an armorer, he ran an armory in mid-18th century France, where he began to standardize the production of gun carriages. So not even weapons, just the carriages on which you were transporting larger pieces of artillery. Nevertheless, it is the exact same principle. You create a prototype, a standard of the carriage, or a standard of the weapon. You put all the different parts on the wall. Then you create ways of measuring the tolerances that can be accepted, or the amount of variation that can be accepted relative to that standard. And everybody needs to be disciplined and drilled into creating identical pieces. So the very first thing that you need to replace with that is skills. People should not bring their skills to the shop, because the skills mean that you're going to try to add a little flourish here and there, that you're going to try to put a little signature here and there, that you're going to try to create that variation is something that is part of what you do. What you want is routinized labor that follows commands. And the best way of implementing that is, of course, in the military. Because in the military, you're already following commands. Everybody is part of a chain of command. Everybody has been drilled, and everybody has been disciplined, and therefore to follow commands without question. So, Honore Blanc had already a running factory, a running armory, where most of the principles that we associate today, large-scale, routinized labor, control in the hands of a managerial class as opposed to an entrepreneur, were already in place. As the story goes, Thomas Jefferson was ambassador in Paris at the time. He was given a tour of Honore Blanc's armory. He was amazed at the efficiency and the modern feeling of the factory, and I'm sure that in the late 18th century, he must have felt very modern, and he must have felt very, this is the future. The future is strict standards of quality and strict identical production of pieces, so that there's absolutely so that the efficiency of supply in the battlefield where spare parts can be increased to the maximum. Thomas Jefferson brought the idea to the United States. He gave the idea to an entrepreneur, Eli Whitney, which was also an inventor. And he was an entrepreneur. Eli Whitney used the idea partly to create revolvers with standard parts. And this is what you're going to read in most history books, because most history books like to put the name of a person as the hero of the story. But the real agent, the real actor in the story were military organizations in Connecticut and Massachusetts. The buildings of those armories and arsenals still exist. They were led by military engineers who were mostly anonymous. I mean, we do have the names, but it wouldn't really matter for me to right now tell you the names, because no one knows about these names. It could have been this military engineer, it could have been another military engineer. The fact of the matter is, it was the organization itself, with its authority structure, that managed to implement Honore Blanc's system in the United States at a very large scale. The motive, or rather the incentive, particularly the financial incentive, came, as usual, from a war. The 1812 war against England, which The United States, the newly independent United States, managed to win barely, but it was almost lost because of the lack of spare parts in front. When they did manage to drive the British away, Congress met, and as usual, after the fact, passed a law trying to fix this and giving this arsenals and armories a mandate, the mandate to implement one more blunt system on a large scale in the United States. By the 1840s, this had already become known as the American system of manufactures, the first system of mass production, 70 years before Henry Ford, 60 years before Henry Ford. And the ideas began to be propagated through the civilian industry by the contract system. The military couldn't build every single component of their weapons, couldn't build every single component of carriages and guns and artillery and so on. So they would outsource it to other companies. But before they would hire someone, before they would actually give someone a contract, they would give them a tour of the arsenal, they would show them the system, and they would say, if you can implement this system with these tolerances outside in your factory, you're making axes, you're making some other products, but if you want to get in the business of supplying us with muskets, or supplying us with rifles, or with components for rifles, then your components need to meet these specs. And little by little, through the contract system, these ideas began to propagate throughout the United States. By the time Henry Ford took them up, this was already a 60-year-old system. So to call it Fordism is simply wrong. It's yet one more thing that Marxists get wrong. They, of course, have to call it Fordism because they need it to be the bourgeoisie who invented this, since the bourgeoisie is their enemy. And they do not consider that military organizations are part of the mixture that needs to be considered when you deal with the story, with the history of this. Another character that's very important here is Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor is the inventor of what it came to be called scientific management. It has nothing scientific about it. It's basically the methodical study, the methodical routinization of labor. That's what it is. Frederick Taylor is famous for being the guy with a stopwatch at the end of the 19th century who would be hired in factories to routinize a particular aspect of production. So he would come in and get 3 or 4 workers that management has said were particularly efficient, and said, okay, so put together this carburetor, put together this particular component of a machine. And he would, with a stopwatch, time each one of the movements. And then we say, I can shave 5 seconds from this particular movement if I arrange the pieces this way. This 3 or 4 movements that you're performing here in the middle are redundant. If you perform them together with the other operation, you will save a couple of seconds here and there. And by shaving a few seconds here and a few seconds there, would create optimized routines for workers who, of course, lost complete control of what they were doing in the shop floor. The moment you lose your skills, the moment you are simply repeating movements that management tells you to repeat, you became an exchangeable cog in the machine. Whereas a skilled person cannot be easily fired because it's not that easy to find someone not only with the skills, but with experience with this machine or with experience with this particular aspect of production. Someone who has been routinized can be easily fired and replaced because all you have to do is train the other person on the exact same routines. So Frederick Taylor had a lot of work at the end of the 19th century. And, of course, Taylorism, as his system came to be known, was part of what made Henry Ford so successful. What is very little known is that Frederick Taylor acquired most of his ideas from either working for arsenals or from his friends that worked in arsenals. In other words, we can in fact trace a line between Honore Blanc and Frederick Taylor. Not a direct genealogical line, but a historical line going through different organizations that take us from the very idea of mass production to the very idea of systematic routinization of labor, and then from then on to 20th century economies of scale. So, we need to get our history right, guys. You know, everybody wants to change capitalism, wants to make capitalism or the economy a fairer, more just place, less oppressive, something that nourishes skills instead of killing them. But if we don't know what the origin of these oppressive systems are, if we keep thinking in a mythological way that, well, it was Henry Ford who invented everything, and all we have to do is change Fordism, then how could we be effective? So, Fordism's out. What about this ugly word here? Post-Fordism. Did Emilia-Romagna and other places like that were like a recent response to economies of scale, like a novelty that was just born after Henry Ford? No, not at all. Here we're going to use as our main source of examples, Jane Jacobs. The book is in your syllabus. It's called The Economy of Cities. She has several books. She's a recently deceased Canadian urbanist who was an autodidact, but whose love for cities comes through her books. I recommend every single one of her books. I mean, it's just the best way of falling in love with cities, of thinking about cities as an object, as a sensual object. And as I said, the point of this class is to give you guys as architects a much more concrete sense of social context. And the best way of getting a concrete sense of social context is by thinking about cities. So Jane Jacobs is an indispensable reading. Jane Jacobs, using a lot of data from Rodale and the Annals School, as well as from other sources, has traced economies of agglomeration to the beginning of the millennium. Other authors, and I'm going to explain her theory in a second, other authors had already pointed out that the Industrial Revolution that happened in England starting in the early 1700s, which was of course driven by fuel, by fossil fuel and large factories, and the steam engine, and eventually the locomotive, were so flashy in terms of, the steam engine. Nothing like that had ever existed in the history of humanity. It was a monster belching out, steam and under high pressures and temperatures, and yet it could perform mechanical work highly efficiently. It was the first engine, the first motor, the beginning of the era of motorized everything, not only motorized factories, but motorized transport, and eventually motorized refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, everything that has an electric motor today in your houses can be traced genealogically to the first engine. It was the first machine that produced motion. So historians were so impressed by what was going on in England that they forgot that there were many other areas in the world, contemporary with the Industrial Revolution, that were also manufacturing things not in an old-fashioned, nostalgic way, but using highly modern, but not large-scale production systems. The best studied example, other than the ones of Jane Jacobs that I'm going to give you right now, is regions in the Alps, both in Switzerland and the Italian Alps and other parts, alpine regions that manufacture both watches, clocks, and cutlery. Now, those are not necessarily very fancy products, but they are high-tech products, particularly watches. And you can see how in the 1700s, 1800s, there are economies of agglomeration. There's many small firms, clusters of small firms in Switzerland manufacturing these kinds of products using skilled labor, small-sized firms, and entrepreneurs instead of managers, and so on, down the list of variables. So even without the work of Jane Jacobs, just by widening the area of research that we do around the 18th century, we can find other areas of Europe where other forms of production, other styles of industrial production were being used. Jane Jacobs, though, is very interesting because it's going to supply us with a concept that is very important for the class of this afternoon. The particular type of economies of agglomeration she studies is something called import-substitution dynamics, and are studied in that book, The Economies of Cities. Jane Jacobs gives us evidence that Venice in the 9th century was selling salt, or exchanging salt, timber, and fish for manufactured products from Constantinople. Just say these are my examples here. Second example is London in the 14th and 15th centuries. 15th century, who was trading wool, leather for manufactured products from Italian cities, Florence, Milan. The third example, actually she gives many more examples, Tokyo and so on, but the third example I am going to examine here actually comprises a team of cities: Boston, Philly, and New York. In the 18th century, when they are still colonies of England, who were selling grain and many other raw materials in exchange for manufactured products from London. Now she calls these areas here supply zones. Now here's the argument. In that book, Jane Jacobs claims that if you are an area of the world, it doesn't matter where you are, who is selling raw materials, whether it is bananas, as in a banana republic, or whether it is oil, as in an oil-rich country, in exchange for manufactured products from somewhere else, you are condemning yourself to become a supply zone, a slave zone of that area. Because you will never build the pool of skills that you need in order to produce your own manufactured products. You become addicted to selling what you already have, what you can extract from the ground, what you can, in other words, you become addicted to selling not only commodities, but low value added products. Yes, agriculture implies labor and implies a certain amount of skill, but doesn't add that much value to the product. Extracting oil from the ground, extracting minerals from the ground, desiccating the waters of the Mediterranean, or vaporizing in order to obtain salt. Well, that takes labor, but it doesn't take that much skill. And so for as long as you are addicted to exchanging salt, timber, and fish for manufactured products, you will never develop your own skills. You will never, in fact, break your chains of dependency. You will be depending on these other cities. And yet Venice, by the 13th century, was already the center of capitalism, according to Fernand Braudel. In 4 centuries, it shed its shackles. London in the 15th century was a supply zone of Italy. It was exchanging wool, leather, and other raw materials for manufactured products from Florence and Milan. And yet, of course, we know that by the 18th century, London is basically the center of the world, the economic center of the world. So in 3 centuries, it shed its shackles. It broke its chains of dependency. But what Jane Jacobs wants to know is how they did it. Now, when we're talking about manufactured products, particularly from the 9th century, we're not talking about anything fancy. We're talking about brushes, we're talking about combs, we're talking about shoelaces, we're talking about sandals, we're talking about simple forms of clothing. So it was nothing flashy. Nevertheless, shoes, shoelaces, belt buckles, brushes, combs need to be created, need to be manufactured, and their manufacture implies skill. So, Jane Jacobs sets out to figure out how they did it. How did Venice break the chains of dependence with Constantinople? How did London do it? How did this team of cities did it later on? And how many others in her book have done it? And he says, well, the secret was to build your own pool of skills. Because the economies of agglomeration depend on the agglomeration, on the clustering of skillful people. So if you manage to create that cluster of skills, then you can manage to create economies of agglomeration and eventually shed your shackles or your chains. And the dynamic she identifies in all three cases is a dynamics of replacing imports. This is roughly how it works. Starting in the 9th century, Venice began to replace some simple imports from Constantinople. Constantinople, of course, being the capital of Roman Empire, of the Eastern Roman Empire, the surviving capital of the Roman Empire. Today is Istanbul. Today, it was taken over by the Turks in the 15th century, 1450s kind of thing. The famous siege of Constantinople that we're going to be talking about in another class. But before that, it was a Christian city, an Orthodox Christian city, but nevertheless a thriving capital, a thriving metropolis with a long tradition of manufacturing, and so it got its raw materials from some third world. I'm using the expression in quotes here, from some banana republic, a salt, timber, and fish republic. Venice, though, realized that this was going on, or the Venetians realized that this was going on, and began to replace the simplest of the imports with locally produced knockoffs. Locally produced knockoffs that they in turn either sold domestically or sold to other backward cities. This is why I'm adding 3 cities here at the bottom, because according to Jacobs, it's always teams of cities that are needed to break the chain of dependence when you begin your history as a supply zone. Imagine that they began to replace belt buckles. Well, belt buckles are metallic, so you need to do a certain amount of local blacksmith work. And then perhaps you're also replacing the belts themselves, so you need to do some leathering. So that's 2 types of skills that you need to develop. At first, your belts with their buckles will not be nearly as good as the imports from Constantinople, but it doesn't matter. You're going to sell them cheaper. They're cheap knockoffs, that's what they are. And all that matters is the skills that you develop doing those cheap knockoffs. With the money you saved from not having to sell salt, timber, and fish in exchange for belt buckles or belts that you already have, instead of just saving that money, you invested in more sophisticated imports from the same city. So that the pool of imports always remains as a target for substitution, and it starts getting more and more sophisticated. You start buying fancier stuff that is harder to reproduce. So by the time you already replace belt buckles, the combs, brushes, and a bunch of the simple stuff, your pool of imports now contains harder to create, for instance, elaborately weaved textiles. So you start buying those elaborately weaved textiles, and eventually you begin replacing them. And so your pool of skills continues to grow, continues to complexify, until your pool of skills is large enough that you don't need to sell raw materials anymore. You have stopped being a supply zone, and you can now start converting other people into your supply zones, because you yourself now are a producer. Now yourself are operating on economies of agglomeration. A similar thing happened beginning in the 15th century in London. It was slightly more elaborate because they were much more aware that this was happening, so they sent industrial spies to Italy to kind of try to learn some trade secrets. They hired Italian artisans. This is something similar to what's going on in China today. They are not only buying companies like the IBM PC, the IBM PC business, it's called Lenovo right now, which in order to acquire the manufacturing skills, but also doing all kinds of ways of replacing imports with locally manufactured production. Finally, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, not so much because they wanted, but because they were colonies of England, and it was illegal to perform any kind of sophisticated manufacturing in the United States, managed to break the law and to, slightly ahead of acquiring political independence from England, to break that chain of dependence by doing local production. Again, the most important point here is the development of the skills, not the products themselves. The products themselves can be cheap knockoffs that are irrelevant. It is the skills that build one after the other. Let me give you one final example because that is the one that best illustrates this point. Jacobs studies Tokyo at the end of the 19th century. And she says, in the 1880s, Tokyo was importing large amounts of bicycles, all fully manufactured bicycles. And the Japanese loved them. So they were all riding bicycles. So the moment there were enough bicycles, the bicycle repair shop began to appear. And now you have a bunch of repair shops, which of course were now doing local repairs, but needed to buy spare parts as imported. After a few years, some of those repairmen realized that they could outsource the production of some of the simplest parts for a bicycle to local producers, and thereby saving themselves the money from having to import them. And since they were the ones who were repairing the bicycles, well, then they had the spare parts right there, ready for them. And little by little, they began to replace every single part of the bicycle, going from the least complex parts to the most complex parts, until the early 20th century, at which point Tokyo was now producing its own bicycles. Now you might think, well, bicycles, compared to cars or compared to, jet engines or something, bicycles are not that important. Well, bicycles are important because bicycles are an example of a geared mechanism. And once you master the simple gears that link the pedals to one of the wheels in a bicycle, you can then tackle something like sewing machines, which is a much more complex geared mechanism, but within the same family of mechanisms. So skills, unlike routines, are flexible and can be applied in a variety of contexts. Routines are typically optimized for a particular purpose. Skills are flexible. Once you develop the skills to create geared mechanisms, you can then apply those geared mechanisms in a variety of contexts. And so, what this proves, and Jane Jacobs gives us plenty of evidence that this is in fact what happened in this area, is that economies of agglomeration are old. As old as the 10th century. And this is just because I'm limiting myself to Europe and to the previous century. It's very possible that once we began to study India, China, the Ottoman Empire, and other types of non-European civilizations, we're going to find examples of economies of scale and economies of agglomeration there too. So the two labels, Fordism and post-Fordism, are entirely useless. We need a better history of these things, guys. And as you can see, everything was directly related to cities. It is cities that were, prior to the existence of industrial hinterlands, it was cities that were the reservoir of skills needed to kick off economies of agglomeration. Now, to finish up this first part of Saturday's class, we meet again, of course, at 2 after the question and answer period. We're going to be switching now to an entirely different subject, although related. The ecology of cities, so we're going to be moving on to biological questions. Before I do that, I want to give you an example of economies of agglomeration that don't necessarily have to be in the same region. Because as I said at the beginning of the semester, at the beginning of the class, long distance transportation and communication technologies have allowed for the creation of communities, have allowed for the creation of organizations that exist dispersed. So the question is, do we have examples, say, in the internet, of economies of agglomeration, the agglomeration of skillful people, only now not necessarily agglomerated in the same space, but agglomerated by network connections. In other words, the same degree of connectivity exists, except that the links in the connections now stretch over long distances to different countries. And the answer is yes. The open source movement is the perfect example of economies of agglomeration occurring at the level of software, in the internet, in an entirely dispersed way, but also depending on entrepreneurs, not managers, with slight differences, because in the open source movement there is no prices. The currency that circulates in these networks is credit, or credit for what you did. The open source movement includes many products, including Linux, which is an operating system, Perl, which is a programming language, Apache, which is a server software. I believe it's in fact the dominant server software, and many other products. In fact, today you can find an open source version of almost everything. Open source 3D programs, open source Photoshop programs, open source word processors, open source browsers like Mozilla and others, open source everything. What is the idea behind open source? Well, the word source, of course, refers to the source code of a program. The source code of a program is the actual program itself. If this condition applies, then move to such and such line of code. Otherwise, execute the following subroutine. Source code looks different depending on what programming language you use. It can be hierarchical, like Pascal or Fortran or C. It can be object-oriented, in which you have software capsules or encapsulated little software objects interacting with each other. So I'm not even going to go into the details. The point is that whether you are doing object-oriented software or hierarchical software, there's going to be a piece of text, many millions of lines of code perhaps, that have the actual code. Now, when you buy, say, Microsoft Office or Windows, or for that matter, most programs that sold for the Mac, you don't get the source code. The source code is a highly kept, tightly kept trade secret. What they do is they compile the source code. They make it into a bunch of ones and zeros, which cannot be reverse engineered except for by the most astute of hackers. Most people, when you get your little CD or your little DVD with your software, you wouldn't know how to reverse engineer that. The source code has been compiled. But if you're going to have 1,000 volunteers all around the world, all of them collaborating on a particular software project, you have to give away the source code. There's absolutely no other alternative, because many of these people don't even know each other. You need to be able to just download the source code from a particular website and then see what areas you believe are deficient and what areas you think you could cooperate, and then you write a piece of software and you submit it to Linux storables in the case of Linux, or to one of the two tenants, and then they will accept it or not accept it. But the source code needs to be out there. What everybody else considers to be a trade secret that cannot possibly be published, they in fact publish it for free. Now the problem with open source, and this is something that everybody saw from the very beginning, is that it is liable to a problem that in economics is called the tragedy of the commons. illustrated with something having nothing to do with software, but having to do with ranchers and their cows, with a public grassland, commons, that serves, without any regulation whatsoever, 20 or so ranchers located at the periphery of this vast grassland, each rancher having 20 cows, say. You have 20 ranchers, 20 cows each, that's 400 cows. As long as everybody has only 20 cows, they can bring them to the public grassland and feed them. The grass can grow again, and you can continue the cycle indefinitely. The problem is that there's always the selfish guy. There's always what is called the free rider. The guy who wants to hitch a ride on the backs of somebody else. The one that says, hey, but if there's no regulation that tells me that it is illegal to have more than 20 cows, why can't I have more than 20 cows? I want 40 cows. So there's the selfish guy, let's put it in black here, with his 40 cows. Next, the next neighbor over here, who was probably a very nice guy before, starts saying that the guy has 40 cows, he's making twice as much money from the milk of the cows, he makes twice as much money from the meat of the cows, and he goes, hey, how come that guy's making twice as much money? I want 40 cows. 40 cows, 40 cows, 40 cows, 40 cows, 40 cows, 40 cows. Now we have 1,600 cows. And the grasslands collapsed. There's just way too many cows for this grassland to replenish itself. And the end is tragic. This is why it's called the tragedy of the commons. It would have been nice had it not been for the selfish guy, because that means that government doesn't have to come in and regulate, and everything can be done through the communal mechanisms that we've been talking about, ridicule and ostracism. But sometimes, it doesn't matter how much you laugh at the 40 cows guy, or how much you refuse to interact with the 40 cows guy, he can be contagious. His selfishness can be contagious, and everybody can go 40 cows, 40 cows, 40 cows. Now, the open source movement was a tragedy of the commons waiting to happen. Because what's going to stop once Linux is a relatively well-developed operating system, if the source code is available, what is to stop somebody, say, Bill Gates' idiot son, let's call him Billy the Idiot, who wanted to impress his dad. I don't think Bill Gates even has a son, so I'm totally making this up. But Billy the Idiot takes the source code from Linux, compiles it, calls it Winx, and starts selling it. See, Dad, I also have my own operating system. What was going to stop that guy from doing that? Nothing. And once one person begins profiting from open source, maybe the other guy gets the idea, hey, wait a minute, how come that guy is making so much money from selling Linux? I want to sell Linux, I want to sell Linux, I want to sell Linux, and all of a sudden the commons collapses. Because without enough volunteers, and without enough people believing that credit is being apportioned fairly, the whole volunteer system behind open source collapses. There's a reason why the leaders of each one of those are almost faceless. They give very few interviews, and when they give interviews, they are literally self-effacing. They don't want to hug the credit, because they know that the only thing that's keeping the thing going is a fair distribution of credit. So, how are they going to prevent the tragedy of the commons? Well, what they did, this was done by a guy called Richard Stallman, who's a hacker and a little bit of a nut. I mean, his ideas are actually not very good. He's a little bit too much of a 60s type with, too much about the heart and feelings and so on, which is okay as long as you don't start pushing that as your agenda. But Richard Stallman, nevertheless, wrote some very important pieces of code for the early open source movement, what he calls the Free Software Foundation, and, most importantly of all, created a piece of institutional machinery, a license called the GPL. PL is for public license, G is for GNU, which is a hacker in joke, and I'm not even going to try to explain what it means. The GPL license, however, is basic because it forces you to share. It is what stabilized open source from becoming, what prevented open source from becoming a tragedy of the commons. Imagine that you are a programmer and that you have been spending a few years now designing some very interesting image processing filters, similar to the ones that you get in Photoshop, only it's like your filters and are different. But you don't want to have to design the entire, all the Photoshop program with the menus and the commands and the screens and so on. And you hear that somebody already is developing an open source Photoshop. So you go to that website, you look at the source code, and you go, yeah, this is exactly what I needed. All I need to do is right now download this and add my own filters, and I can then run it, and I'm going to have my own custom designed Photoshop. Well, when you download what's already been done in open source Photoshop, up in the corner, there's going to be a copyright notice. In fact, it's not called copyright, it's called copyleft. Hippie humor. So it says copyleft. If you are going to use any of this source code for your own purposes, then you commit yourself to sharing whatever piece of software you add to this software. That's all copyleft is. It's a software license that has the same weight, the same legal weight as the licenses that you hear that you open. If you open this wrapper, now you have committed yourself to, not copy the software or whatever. It has legal weight as software, and that it forces you to share. If you use any amount of code from that's already open source, then whatever you contribute with must be open source. That was brilliant. The left has never been particularly good, and I shouldn't say the left, because the left is a rarefied generality like the market or the state of somebody who shoot me when I turn around. On average, left people that are self-described leftists, on average, people self-described as leftists have never been particularly good at doing small institutional interventions. They want the revolution. And if it's not the revolution, then they don't want anything. A license? God, what's a license? That's like a tiny little piece of machinery. Well, yes, it's a tiny little piece of machinery, but it's a piece of machinery that stabilizes a particular form of economies of agglomeration. And that is fantastic. The GPL license actually works. It has a stabilized open source, and it has allowed it to continue to flourish. The inventor of the GPL, Richard Stallman, of course, doesn't really get this. For him, the very fact that you're forcing people to share is a bad thing. Because, of course, if you force people to share, are they sharing, from their heart? Who cares? I mean, you really would like to bitch slap this guy until he snaps out of it. Snap out of it, punk-ass little bitch. What is the matter with you? Who cares where it comes from the heart? Think of it as a piece of machinery that became part of an assemblage and that stabilized that assemblage. The assemblage itself, as I've insisted throughout the class, yes, it does depend on people having certain motivations it depends on people having certain beliefs and certain desires. Some people being altruistic, some people being strict reciprocators, some people just liking to do public service. But the assemblage itself, although it does depend on people having certain beliefs and acting in a certain way, does not depend on any particular distribution of beliefs. So the GPL license stabilizes the assemblage, regardless of whether the motivation is to give from your heart. It's forcing you to share. Who cares? The people who were going to share anyway, we're going to share anyway. And all this is doing is making it hard for the free riders to provoke a tragedy of the commons. It prevented a tragedy of the commons, and that should be enough for Richard Stallman. Unfortunately, it isn't. But we shouldn't care either. I don't know why I bitch slap him. I'm being videoed right now. Richard, if that's you, I didn't mean to call you a punk-ass little bitch. I really didn't. You're great. You stabilize the assemblage. That's what everybody needs. Who cares about what your motivation is? The result was fantastic. And this thing is now a distributed form of economies of agglomeration flourishing in the internet. Many other things are now becoming open source because this now has become the exemplary achievement. And once you have an exemplary achievement, some example to guide you, it becomes much simpler to start to own other types of open source software, open source projects, even if they don't have anything to do with software. They must have something to do with intellectual property and being able to be performed, distributed, and so on. And it has also given rise to GPL to now a website called Creative Commons, directed by, what's his name? Lawrence Lessig, who is a jurist, he's a scholar of the law, who has actually argued several intellectual property cases in front of the Supreme Court. Lessig, inspired by the GPL, now has started his own website in which he gives free licenses to people who want to publish things with different degrees of strength. So for instance, if you are going to publish your own music free in iTunes, you might want to go to Creative Commons and download, you download documents in lawyerese, that is in language that only a lawyer would understand, but you need that. And then you can download it in language that you understand. So you download both, and then it gives you choices. You can, for instance, say, well, yes, everybody can use my music for any film project as background for your films and so on, as long as you're not making any money. Or you can get another license that says everybody can use my music for any purposes whatsoever, even if you're making money. So now, what Lawrence Lessig has done is create a variety of GPL licenses, so to speak, with different levels of strength, so that artists who want to share their intellectual property can do it, but within whatever limits the artist says it should be. And I believe that is the better way of doing it, because not every artist is going to want to share everything. For instance, not every artist is going to want to sell their music or their graphics and so on if the other person is making money out of it. So you might want to just stop the free riders right there. Or you might just want to be totally altruistic and pick the altruistic version of the license. So Lawrence Lessig has understood that there are different motivations for doing this, that different artists will have different motivations for sharing their intellectual property, and that they should give you licenses with different weights or different strengths. So that's the GPL now having evolved into a website that now has a whole variety of licenses. That is the way in which economies of agglomeration work. That is the way in which they work. You invent one thing, the invention of one thing becomes an exemplary achievement that motivates the invention of further refinements, specializations of that thing, and the pool of skills just keeps growing. Okay guys, as I said, this is it for economics. When we come back at 2, we are going to be talking about ecology, but we're not going to be breaking completely with this for the following reason. An economist, when they think of a barrel of oil or a ton of coal, they think of it in terms of its price. What is the price of a barrel of oil? Today it's $110. A few months ago it was $80. People are sweating it because it might go all the way up to $140, depending on what happens in Libya and other crises in the Middle East. But for the economists, all that matters is that that barrel of oil has a price that's going up and down according to demand and supply, or because of speculation, which is another reason why prices move in one direction or another. And the reason why oil is valuable is not of their interest. There must be some reason, otherwise we wouldn't have a price, but we don't care. We care about the kinds of information that's transmitted by the prices so that you can perform an efficient allocation of scarce resources that have alternative uses. You can use oil to produce plastics, you can use oil to produce gasoline, you can produce oil for a variety of polymeric functions and materials. So they are alternative uses, and it is a non-renewable resource, so it's scarce, meaning you have to make decisions, allocated decisions, and that's all that economists care about once something has a price. But we don't care only about that. We want to know why oil is valuable. And of course we know that as fossil fuel, oil, all it is the corpses of plants and animals that died millions of years ago and got buried under special circumstances, specifically without oxygen, so that aerobic bacteria could not dismantle those corpses and break it down into minerals and reject them into the soil. Here they die in an atmosphere in a condition without oxygen, so they slowly, over millions of years and under very high pressures and high temperatures, become fossil fuel. Now, because those corpses of plants and animals ultimately were originally part of an ecosystem, and in an ecosystem the plants take the first bite of a food chain. The plants, through photosynthesis, capture solar energy and transform it into sugars, which are molecules that store chemical energy. Then those sugars, the glucose, fructose, and a variety of sugars, are eaten by herbivores, transformed into herbivore flesh, muscle. The herbivores are eaten by carnivores, and therefore those corpses of plants and animals that were buried underground and became oil were ultimately solar energy to begin with. Solar energy that has become fossilized, fossil fuels. And so the reason why oil is expensive, the reason why we fight wars over it, is not its price, it's its inherent value as a store of energy. A store of energy that once was part of an ecosystem. It was part of the energy that flows through an ecosystem. So when we get back at 2, we're going to be talking about cities as ecosystems. We're going to be talking about the history of food. Where do they get their food? And as we will see, they get their food from supply zones. At first, those were zones kept underdeveloped so that they continue to supply food instead of competing against your manufacturers. So the original supply zones, as we will see, are the immediate countrysides of cities. As colonialism went on, supply zones started to get farther and farther away. Entire continents were transformed into supply zones for a while. And so what we're going to be interested in is how energy and nutrients flow through food chains and what kinds of food chains exist within cities. So as you will see, it's an entirely different subject, but it is complementary. Because we don't want to think of a barrel of oil only as a price. We want to think of it as a store of energy. And economics doesn't do that. We need to bring ecologists into the mix to help us understand that connection. Okay? That is what we're going to be doing starting at 2 o'clock today. Meanwhile, let's see if there's some questions. Yes?
I'm not sure if I just missed this, but when you were discussing the supply zones and then they're supplying to, I guess, manufacturing zones, would be considered? Does, for instance, Venice supplies to Constantinople, and then is there Constantinople then supplying back to Venice or in
with manufactured products
of the same goods that they use from Venice?
Well, rather, Venice supplies raw materials, and Constantinople supplies manufactured objects. So raw materials have very little value added because it's just the physical labor of extracting them from the soil or drying up the Mediterranean water and creating salt. So there's labor, but the type of labor that's routine and doesn't add that much value. And you're exchanging them for products of skills which have value added, right? So that creates a relationship of dependency. You are a banana republic or a timber, salt, and fish republic who is completely dependent on the skills that have accumulated in the center. And the idea is how to break a chain of dependence. Well, you need to develop your own skills, but you cannot command that into existence. You cannot be the Venetian government in the 10th century and say, hey people, wake up. We are like Constantinople's bitches, We need to develop our own independence. And let's do that. It needs to grow organically. So it begins when some local producers begin to realize, hey, wait a minute, we're paying too much for this stuff. And this belt buckles, this belts, this shoes could be produced locally. And you begin to replace them with local production. That begins to give you that self-confidence. Hey, we can do it. And again, you need teams of cities because you're going to be producing tons of cheap knockoffs and you're only going to be able to consume so many of them locally, so you need other backward cities to exchange cheap knockoffs with. This is why I've got a team of cities, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. The same thing is with London and Venice, only I can't remember right now the other cities, but they are in Jane Jacobs' book. So little by little, via import substitution, you eventually reach the critical mass of skills at which point you don't have to import things anymore. Or you just have to import a few super luxury items that you don't want to manufacture locally because there's a tiny demand. Only a few princes and bishops or so on are going to buy those super expensive robes, say. So you keep importing those from Constantinople. At that point, you've already developed a pool of skills that's good enough that you can now become the master of other supply zones. You can begin treating England, for instance, as a supply zone of wool, of leather, and other raw materials, until London gets it together and begins to break its own chains. So the idea is that there's a lesson here, and this is why Jane Jacobs wrote that book. There's a lesson here for today's underdeveloped nations, many of which can be super millionaires or billionaires like Saudi Arabia by selling their oil. But if you're selling your oil and you're not developing and exchanging it for manufactured products, whether weapons, cars, construction materials, you bring designers to build your buildings and so on, and they are all foreigners, well, then you're not developing your pool of skills. And oil is a non-renewable resource. 100 years down the road, they're going to be back where they were 100 years ago, because they are not using that wealth to reinvest it in developing human capital. Okay? And so there's a lesson there for many so-called third world countries that expression is obsolete because it was only valid when the Soviet Union existed. It was Europe and the United States were the first world, the Soviet bloc was the second world, and then everybody else was the third world. Since the Soviet bloc doesn't exist anymore, there's no second world, well, we don't have a third world anymore, but you know what I'm talking about. Underdeveloped countries that have very little local skills and very little local industry, and yet are rich in raw materials. Well, those raw materials are going to run out. And if you don't take advantage of that period of time where you're rich in raw materials to engage in some kind of import substitution dynamic, I can imagine, with how awful, for instance, word processors have become, bloated with features that nobody wants, and not, Latin American countries, for instance, should start developing their own software right now. Simple, lean word processors that fit in very tiny little memories, so they would fit net tops, or what they call it, the laptops that are much cheaper, $100 laptops that can connect to the internet, that can run on and that are specialized for your language. They have Spanish spelling checkers, they have Spanish grammar advisors, and so on. And all the bloated stuff of Microsoft Office and other word processors taken away. Again, the idea is not that you're going to make tons of money selling those local word processors. The idea is that you're going to develop a hacker culture or a programming, all the programming skills that are needed to go into a word processor now are being developed in your own country. And now those programmers, after getting bored with writing a cheap knockoff of Word or Office, can now begin developing original software. But without that first layer of skills, you cannot get to the second level, which is to start producing original products. So there's a lesson in Jane Jacobs for today, for underdeveloped regions. Engage in some form of import substitution, begin targeting certain imports, not because of the imports themselves. They can be very non-flashy and humble because of the skills and the pool of skills that you need to build locally. That's a lesson that has not been absorbed by most countries. Human capital is much more important in many cases than machines, much more important than financial capital, in many cases much more important than the kind of touristic capital that you may have with your ruins and your 16th century buildings and so on. That is what attracts tourists. But tourism is a very fickle industry, and it doesn't lead to any kind of self-sustained economic development. Economies of agglomeration do. Yes.
When you were talking about economies of agglomeration and turnover rate by workers, who dictates those turnover rates? The workers?
I say it's the workers. I say it is the work. I mean, it's half and half. Because if you're a large firm where seniority counts as far as your salary and your position, so that as there are, for instance, many firms in Japan, where it does matter how many years you spend there, so that you can be a 60-year-old that's been there for 40 years, and a flashy newcomer is not going to take your job, as it happens in the United States, right? A 60-year-old is seen as an old geezer who has ideas about software from 60 years ago, and you want the younger people, right? So it doesn't pay, but if seniority pays, because that's the structure of the corporation, then that's the corporation determining the turnover rate, or at least influencing it. It's slowing it down. Seniority counts, so I'm going to retain most of my staff. So it's going to be a very low turnover rate. But in Silicon Valley, it is partly the region, because the availability of new startups, and therefore the availability of exciting new jobs, and it's the decisions of people to leave because they are bored with routine work. So there is a complex form of decision making. The structure of the organization affects it. If seniority counts, turnover rate is low. It's a function of the region, because for you to leave your job of 3 years, you need to be sure that you're going to be hired in a more exciting job. So it's a lot of startups are beginning and with new ideas, and look, it's a new idea how to use GPS system, or this is a new idea how to use social network system, or this is a new idea how to do this. And now that you can get excited again, then you move after 3 years to that new, and then to a new startup. But there's got to be availability of jobs. Otherwise you would never sacrifice your career for the pure excitement. But there's also the subjective aspect. Talented people at some point begin to feel that their work has become too routine. It's not challenging anymore. It is not forcing you to develop new skills, and you feel like you are becoming rusty. You feel like you are, you're now being left behind. You see with envy all those youngsters that don't have all that weight of many years behind them and can learn new software real fast. So that might give you a personal motivation to leave and go, hey, I'm going to just keep getting new jobs because what I want is to be constantly challenged. But of course, the region needs to have all those exciting jobs, and that is what economies of agglomeration achieve. The more talented people gather in a region, the more talented people will want to move into the region. For the benefits of talk, of shop talk, there are things you cannot learn in books. There are things that you can only learn by chatting in a pub or in a bar after work with similar software programmers or similar hardware designers. And that is part of the learning process. So that's part of the attraction of Silicon Valley. This is why a lot of firms keep on moving to Silicon Valley and not to Route 128.
Is there an analysis available where you can say which regions tend to develop more of an economies of scale as compared to economies of agglomeration? Like, for example, in my general observation, I would think that developed countries develop more of scale as compared to underdeveloped nations, which tend to develop more economies of agglomeration because they have more skills and they are being overshadowed by companies that spend more there and develop routine labor. But in the end, we see more of small-scale shops being developed, like you mentioned Tokyo, as an example. So in underdeveloped nations, we can develop more.
Yes, I mean, there is a certain correlation like the one you say, although it's not that simple. It also depends on government policies. For instance, in Europe, yes, there was a tendency. First of all, in Europe, prior to World War II, cartels were not illegal. In Germany, for instance, which means that there was an incentive, not only to become part of an oligopoly, but to actually to develop a cartel that controlled and manipulated prices. Cartels were made illegal in the United States at the end of the 19th century when the railroads tried to, they were an oligopoly, but a cartel is more than an oligopoly. A cartel is an oligopoly working together. So it really is a monopoly with several heads. Teddy Roosevelt declared those illegal. So in this country, there's anti-monopoly laws. In countries without anti-monopoly laws, there's all the incentive in the world for oligopolies to become monopolies or to become at least cartels. So that obviously is an incentive towards economies of scale. On the other hand, many third world countries or many developed, underdeveloped countries, say like Mexico, that have many, we have a very large pool of skills, as you can see just from the knickknacks that they create for tourists and so on. I mean, that might be not a very good example of industrial production, but you can see that there's different styles in different states, for instance, and that people locally are proud of their different styles of knickknacks and folk art. So the skills are there, and yet the government of Mexico has, just as a matter of policy, benefited large businesses every step of the way, despite the fact that it goes against their interests. Because, for instance, we have our Wonder Bread, our manufacturer of packaged bread called Bimbo, right? Bimbo has been given a break over and over and over again by the Mexican government because it's a national champion. It's something you can feel proud of. But Bimbo is so self-contained as a corporation that it could move out of Mexico if it wanted to. It could just move to Guatemala or move to some place in the Caribbean where there's very small taxes. If the government begins to fool with Bimbo in terms of wanting to tax it more or in terms of trying to say, hey, you're monopolizing illegally the distribution of bread and that is bad for food security, any kind of government intervention that they don't like, they could leave. So governments everywhere could benefit from economic agglomeration because economic agglomeration cannot go anywhere. They depend on the local pool of talent that has formed there, and now, on the contrary, there's an incentive to move in. There's no incentive to move out. And yet, both third world governments as well as first world governments continue to promote their local champions, continue to promote some big TV company, for instance, and to monopolize TV production, to monopolize certain aspects of oil production. And the reason why, again, is that economic theory hasn't caught up with these ideas. I mean, we don't have good enough models for this. Computer simulations, as I mentioned before, are going to change this because multi-agent systems, which are already in production, already exist, allow you to just unleash 1,000 different rational decision makers, so to speak, and see them, or 1,000 small firms, each one an agent in the software, and then see what kinds of emergent properties are produced from their interactions. You couldn't do that with math. And computers have just recently become cheap enough, and the memory and CPU power large enough to be what supercomputers were in the 90s, which means that you can now run those kinds of simulations that you used to need to be like in line and get a special fellowship, a special grant to rent time in that supercomputer. Now you can do it on your desktop. So there will be a revolution, an epistemological revolution, the way we generate knowledge about assemblages or about wholes with emergent properties. Because in computers, things do emerge, and you can see them emerge. And therefore, you can now, as simulations acquire more currency as epistemological tools, you can now show them to government officials. Look, This is a simulation of this particular state that right now is the poorest state in your country. We injected it with a few little firms producing local knockoffs of certain previously imported products. And then we ran the simulation for 20 virtual years. And look where it is right now. Unemployment was at 50%, now it is at 12%. The gross product of the entire state was this slice of the gross national product, now is 50% of your gross national product. See the simulation? Okay, now invest in that state. Seed that state with economies of agglomeration. Nobody really is doing that. Right? Clusters emerge, they emerge in Italy because Emilia-Romagna had a long craft tradition going back for centuries. Also, it had a long leftist tradition. Even the local Communist Party contributed, as much as that hurts me to admit, it contributed to the creation of the first Emilia-Romagna back in the 70s, back in the 60s. But it had to grow organically. So there's really nothing about Italy per se. Its political class being too corrupt and too kind of unskilled and incompetent to actually have come up with that idea. It grew up organically in the middle of a first world country. So the question is, so I don't think that there is a real correlation between first world and developed and underdeveloped countries and the two economies, although there is definitely a correlation between certain countries that feel that they need to champion and they need to promote national champions. A national car maker. We cannot get, your France, we cannot let Peugeot, we cannot let Renault go out of business because that would be bad for our national pride. Or, and so on. The same thing for, they developed their own computer system, Minitel, I don't know what it was called, that it's now totally obsolete, but as a matter of national pride, they didn't want to be importing American technology. Well, sometimes those government projects fail tremendously. They do not develop into economies of agglomeration. And so there's a lot of know-how that still needs to be developed at the level of policymakers as to how to do this, how to seed areas with local producers and then how to nurture them until enough of the assemblage has put itself together and then let go. And just let that region grow. Right? We haven't done it, although the evidence is starting to accumulate from Jane Jacobs, from Fernando Rodell, from a bunch of other people, that this is indeed the case. And again, I believe that the catalyst for this is going to be computer simulations. Because what we need is now a way of proving it to policymakers that this works. And the best way of doing it is having something emerge by itself in a computer simulation. Just all you did was input a whole population of small firms, virtual firms. Everything else came out by itself. That's truth. And so that's, I think that is something that's coming on. It's going to mature in the next 10 years. That new approach to policymaking, right, based on simulations. Yeah.
Does the Jane Jacobs model of import-substitution dynamics account for service industries like designers and like doctors and lawyers and people who become so specialized that there's no more material collateral for what they're doing? It's kind of an expert service industry that I guess there's kind of an inherent danger with that when other countries start developing that cheaper. Now that we have globalized networks, we can start kind of getting those skills from other places.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think it applies to that. So we would need another model for that. But you're absolutely right. We've been concentrating on stuff throughout the class, carburetors or cones and belt buckles and steam engines, things that you produce in a factory. But clearly, a large part of the economy is not producing stuff. It's providing services, medical services, legal services, educational services, even entertainment. It involves producing stuff, movies and so on, but the kind of stuff that can be duplicated so easily that the product itself is not so much what values the intellectual property that goes into developing the movie or that game and so on. And all of that was left outside of the class. So it would be interesting. I don't have a very good answer to your question right now. I mean, I don't know who has theorized this, but now that you mention it, I'm gonna find out, because clearly the model is incomplete if we don't add services. And what you're saying also, I mean, you added another point, which is that the internet is allowing for the outsourcing of these services, which fights economies of agglomeration, right? In the sense that if you can outsource it to cheaper labor and skilled labor elsewhere, well, then you're going to do it, but that's going to lead to the de-skilling of the population. If the skills, as we argued yesterday, are learned by example, or rather taught by example and learned by doing, by actually exercising the skill, and the more you practice, the better you get at it. If a particular country, because it's outsourcing certain services, certain skill services, ceases to teach by example and ceases to practice those skills, in a couple of generations, those skills disappear from the population. And what you want, and those costs in human capital, eroded human capital, should be added to the costs of the corporation to see in the final analysis, well, how much money you made. So it's not just the money in your books, it's also the ecological costs that you had, right? If you're a mining company, those ecological costs are going to appear 60 years later, perhaps when the firm doesn't even exist anymore, and it is the taxpayers who are going to have to pay for those costs, as well as the cost not for the erosion of natural resources, but the erosion of human capital. Because nobody has included that in a cost and benefit analysis in a systematic way. We don't know how much, how costly it can be to start outsourcing skilled labor. Because one thing is to outsource, certain services like answering, certain customer service functions, where you're basically just reading a manual. And is your problem this? Well, then your solution might be this or that, which can be really anybody who speaks English as long as they have the manual, right? If you have routinized that to the point where it can become part of the manual, well, then you can outsource that, and it doesn't really matter because all you're losing is routine jobs. And that's not a loss at all. But once the internet begins to allow you to, for instance, diagnose people from far away via sensors and so on that you can wear, and you can just plug yourself into the net, and a doctor in India or a doctor in China or a doctor in Mexico can tell you what you have for a tenth of the price, that might start having effects on the incentive that people have to become doctors in the United States. It's 7 years, 8 years of medical school, pre-med and medical school. That's a long time. If your career prospects are not that bright, you might start choosing another career. You might start going to business school instead, or you might start going into law school.
Or leave the country.
Or leave the country. But say that you don't, but you start choosing another career. And now there's going to be a shortage of doctors. And that's going to be bad for the U.S. in general, right? So yes, we have to be careful about the positive. That's another, creating economies of agglomeration that are dispersed all over the world, which the internet makes possible, might actually have the wrong effect in terms of erosion of human capital in certain countries that took a long time to accumulate that human capital, and now let it erode away or dissipate. And that would be a cost that needs to be included whenever we make a cost and benefit analysis of what's going on. Yes?
So that would pick up on the City of London's strength in terms of retaining its strength, but also its political clout to get dispensations from London in general to remain where it is, so it doesn't erode to Southeast Asia, for example.
The accumulation of financial talent in the City of London is a form of capital. It's like we were talking about the other day with Genoa in the 15th century. All the silver that came from mines in Mexico and Peru in the 1600s, 1700s, it would take 6 months for a ship, say, to go, and 6 months to come back, or 3 months and 3 months, which means that silver would arrive in large quantities in Europe, and then there would be 6 months of no silver. So what the kings of Spain did is, well, if that's our silver, let's process it through Genoa, because Genoa has an accumulation of financiers. They lend us money throughout the year. It's almost like converting alternate current. 6 months a big amount of silver, then 6 months of nothing, into direct current. They're almost like an electrical transformer, lending throughout the year to the kings of Spain. But of course, when you make the calculations, the people who actually benefit from the silver from the New World were the Genoese, not so much the Spanish. So an accumulation of financiers in Dubai, an accumulation of financiers in Genoa or in London is an asset. It's a pool containing human capital. And if you begin doing government policies that create a disincentive to either develop those skills or practice those skills there, then you begin eroding your human capital, and in a couple of decades you fall behind, because all the cities are going to take up the slack. That's what you meant, right?
Yeah,
I mean, they clearly are conscious of that.
Yeah.
Remember that England is probably the most self-aware economic nation ever, because they were first there for everything. The first national market, as we saw the other day. The first Fed, that is the Bank of England, the first national bank, which is different than regular banks. The national bank is the bank that handles public debt. At least the original Bank of England, that's what it did. Amsterdam was the place where all the money was accumulated, because it was, prior to London in the 17th century, the center of capitalism in terms of finance and commerce. So that's where all the money was. So the Bank of England was created basically to borrow from the Dutch as a government, and then not pay the debt, but service it. So you earmarked certain taxes, which were there to service the debt, pay the interest every month. And you knew that you could just extend that debt forever. You never really had to pay it, as long as you earmarked taxes so that it would automatically be serviced. That idea, the idea of a public debt that you don't have to really pay as long as you service it constantly, was invented by the British, right? And which means that they were inventing organizations and institutions to fit within the global scheme of things. That has given them an awareness of their place in the world economy, and the value of their talents, and the value of the services they can provide, that many other countries don't have. They have 300 years of shared experience that I'm sure is in books and is part of the memory of these organizations, right? Part of their tradition. And therefore, they have every incentive to be aware as to just what would happen if, for instance, you start limiting bankers' bonuses. Right now, everybody's going, if you almost ruin the economy, how can you possibly get all of those bonuses, right? It has happened here, it has happened there. And the answer by the banks is, we need to retain talent. Now, the fight still is going on in England right now. Every time someone announces that some banker that's retiring got a £20 million bonus, everybody's up in arms, because of course they almost ruined the entire economy. How could possibly be getting bonuses for that? And yet, others claim, look, we need to retain talent, because that pool of skills, if it disappears, we're not going to be able to recreate it by command. We're going to have to wait for it to organically grow again, and that may just set us back 10 years, 15 years relative to other centers like Frankfurt or other parts of Europe that are beginning to compete with London for those types of services.
So does that make sense about retaining knowledge that they're arguing for? The diagram that you had on the board, is that worth differentiating in relation to economies of scale or economies of agglomeration that are producing repetitive items as opposed to unique items? So I'm thinking that in terms of computers, it's at the end of the day, to some extent, there's a repetitive nature of the one is the same thing in the same way that salt is or tobacco is. But in terms of economies of scale or economies of agglomeration that produce unique things might
Well,
be...
that would be certainly one of the differences, right? I mean, you need to, in economies of agglomeration, you need to invent new products.
But also you might have economies of scale that produce unique items, maybe not as successfully as economies of agglomeration, but...
Well, today, computers are making that possible, right? Because now your assembly lines have become programmable. Before computers came along, where computers were mostly hardware, and software was basically providing just a control, a function, as opposed to today, in which the hardware is basically dumb, and most of the intelligence comes from the software. In the old days, when software was dumb and hardware was king, it was very hard to retool an assembly line to produce a new product. Right? It was very hard to customize mass production. It seems like a complete oxymoron, something that, a contradiction. It's either mass production or it's custom production. You cannot have it both ways. Well, as it happens, you can have it both ways now. Because now it's relatively easy to retool an assembly line via software to semi-customize the products, to introduce variation in the products. The basic idea, say the chassis of the car, is still going to be one chassis, one basic body plan for a whole series of cars, but you can retool the software so that on the outside, at least, it looks like you have 7, 8, 10 models when in fact you're just basically using the basic, chassis, the basic body plan for the car. But nevertheless, that would give you some kind of economies of agglomeration. I mean, you're not economies of agglomeration, but it would give you some kind of variety in your products, similar to the ones that economies of agglomeration, because it has so many different designers, would have a plurality of styles, to purchase. I will still say that it is limited compared to real economies of agglomeration. Because in a real economy of agglomeration, like Emilia Romagna, when you're competing in terms of design, not costs, all the competition is about who comes up with a new thing. Right? And there's 20,000 firms or 10,000 firms. Well, that's a lot of points of view. That's a lot of designers. It's very hard to try to reproduce the richness of points of view that you have in a 10,000 firm ecosystem by changing the software in your assembly line. Nevertheless, you're absolutely right. Customization of mass production has become possible, and therefore some of the aspects of mass production that were the most obvious. Well, I'm going to be wearing the exact same watch as you, and which doesn't give any possibility for individual expression or style, can now be ameliorated via software. Whether that in itself produces a pool of skills, though, is a different matter, right? Because one thing is the products, and a completely different thing is the skills that you develop making the products. In this case, the only skills that you're producing is software skills. The guy who wrote the software that's customizable. But basically, the rest of the assembly line, however customized, this is still routine. And so you're not really enriching a country with your presence by developing skills that then can be applied to many other things. You're injecting variation at the level of the product, not at the level of the process.